The old man is dying when she finds him collapsed beside his hives, stung over 200 times across his face and neck and arms, body in anaphylactic shock, lips turning blue like a drowned man, breathing in shallow gasps that sound like someone drowning on dry land. And he has maybe 10 minutes before his heart stops completely. 15-year-old Clara Reed doesn't know CPR beyond what she half remembers from a single health class presentation years ago. Doesn't have a phone to call for help because she sold it 2 weeks ago for $43 that went entirely to grocery money. Doesn't even know this man's name beyond what valley people call him, the beekeeper everyone avoids. But she knows 3 things with absolute certainty. He's the hermit who lives alone on 40 acres that no one else will go near. The valley has whispered stories about him for years, strange and reclusive and possibly dangerous. And right now, in this exact moment, she's the only person within 5 miles who can save his life. What she doesn't know yet is that saving his life will change hers forever in ways she can't begin to imagine. That the gift he gives her in his final weeks will provide far more than food or money or shelter. It will give her purpose, community, knowledge, and a way to survive in these Appalachian mountains where a starving orphan girl has no future. Because what's in those 50 hives isn't just honey worth thousands of dollars. It's legacy. It's 3 generations of knowledge. It's a complete way of life. And legacy, when you're 16 and drowning in grief and hunger, is the only thing worth more than gold. This is the story of how a dying beekeeper and a desperate girl became family in the time they had left, and how 50,000 bees taught her what it means to truly live. Clara's story starts 3 weeks earlier, and it starts the way too many mountain kids' stories start in these forgotten Appalachian hollows. Parents dead in a propane explosion, the kind of tragedy that happens when poverty forces you to use equipment that should have been replaced decades ago, but you can't afford new. She'd been at school that October morning, 9th grade English class, reading To Kill a Mockingbird and thinking about nothing important. Came home to find emergency vehicles, yellow caution tape, and a crater where her family's trailer used to stand. Parents gone instantly, no siblings, no other family willing or able to take in a teenage girl with no money and no prospects. Foster care was supposed to be temporary. That's what the social worker promised, with tired eyes that suggested she'd seen too much. But Clara knew how these things went in Appalachia. Temporary became permanent. Foster homes became holding cells until you aged out at 18 with nothing. She'd seen it happen to 3 friends already. She ran instead, made the decision in 30 seconds, while the social worker filled out paperwork. Took her backpack, grabbed the $83 from her mother's purse that the sheriff had given her, and disappeared into the mountains she'd grown up exploring. Found an abandoned hunting cabin 5 miles from any road, up a ridge where no one would think to look. Someone's deer camp from decades ago. 1 room with a loft, roof mostly intact. Survived for 3 weeks on what she could scavenge. Creek water boiled to avoid geodea. Wild greens she could identify. Watercress and dandelion and chickweed that her grandmother had taught her about before she died. 2 rabbits she trapped using snares made from wire. And increasing desperation as weather got colder and food got scarcer, and she realized winter was coming and she had no plan. She was starving slowly, but couldn't figure out how to fix it. Couldn't go into town because someone would recognize her and call social services. Couldn't hunt effectively with no gun and minimal knowledge. Was losing weight she couldn't afford to lose. Dropping from 120 pounds to maybe 100, her clothes hanging loose, her energy non-existent, getting weaker daily, sleeping more and moving less, her body starting to shut down systems to conserve energy. She found the Beekeeper by accident on a morning when she'd been seriously considering giving up entirely and accepting whatever came next, because foster care at least meant regular meals. Following a deer trail, looking desperately for ramps or watercress before the first hard freeze killed everything. Heard a sound that didn't belong. A cry for help, weak and desperate, coming from ahead through thick rhododendron. Followed it to a cleared area, maybe 2 acres. 30 white wooden boxes in neat rows. Beehives, though. She'd never seen that many together. And beyond them, a man lying on the ground covered in bees, not moving much. Clara ran toward him without thinking about safety. Pure instinct. He was maybe 75, thin and weathered, wearing a beekeeper's suit that was unzipped and useless. His face and neck and hands were covered in stings, hundreds of them, swelling rapidly. His eyes were open but unfocused. His breathing shallow and ragged, wheezing that meant airway constriction. He was dying right in front of her. "What happened?" she asked, kneeling beside him, brushing beers off his face with bare hands and getting stung 3 times immediately. "Knocked over hive," he whispered, barely audibly. "Dropped frame, queens released, defending, EpiPen, cabin." He gestured weakly toward a small structure 50 yards away. Clara didn't hesitate. Grabbed his arms, started dragging him away from the hives where bees still swarmed. Got stung 8 times in the process, 5 on her arms and 3 on her neck, each sting burning like touching a hot stove. But she kept pulling until they were far enough that bees stopped following. Then she ran to the cabin. Door unlocked. Mountain people rarely lock doors this far from town. Inside was meticulously organized, decades of careful living evident. Found the EpiPen immediately, mounted on the wall in a red first aid kit. Bright orange case labeled epinephrine. Grabbed it and ran back. Read instructions while running. Remove blue cap, press orange end against outer thigh through clothing. Hold for 3 seconds. She did exactly that. Jabbed it through his pants into his thigh muscle, felt the mechanism activated. Held it while counting 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. His breathing eased almost immediately. The blue tinge around his lips faded to pink. Still in terrible shape, but not actively dying anymore. She stayed with him for 2 hours while his body fought the venom. Sat in the grass watching for deterioration, ready to get help, though she had no idea how. He drifted in and out of consciousness. When finally stable enough to sit up and speak clearly, he looked at her with sharp eyes, despite the swelling. "Who are you?" "Clara Reed," she said. "I was just walking by. Heard you call for help." He studied her for a long moment, taking in her dirty clothes, her too thin frame, the desperation she couldn't hide. "You're the girl whose parents died. The one who ran from foster care. I know who you are. Valley talks. Everyone knows everything eventually." His voice was rough, but not unkind. Clara tensed, ready to run if he'd call authorities, but he just nodded slowly. "You saved my life. I owe you a debt." Mountain people still believed in debts, obligations that couldn't be dismissed. His name was Samuel Oakes. He'd been keeping bees in these mountains for 53 years. Lived alone since his wife died 20 years back. Had no family, no children, no one who'd care if he died tomorrow. Yes, he knew people avoided him. Called him strange, made-up stories. Didn't bother him much anymore. "You need food," he said, looking at her with practiced assessment. "I can see you're starving. Come back tomorrow morning. I'll teach you about bees. You help me manage them, I'll feed you. Fair trade." Clara came back the next morning because she had no better options and was desperate enough to accept help from a stranger everyone said was weird. The education began immediately and was more intensive than anything she'd learnt in school. Samuel taught her that beekeeping wasn't just about honey, though honey was valuable. It was about understanding a superorganism, 30 to 50,000 individual bees functioning as one entity with collective intelligence scientists still didn't fully comprehend. Each hive was a society more complex than most human organizations. The queen who could lay 2,000 eggs daily for years, the workers who foraged, built comb, nursed larvae, guarded entrances, regulated temperature, and lived just 6 weeks during active season. The drones, whose only function was mating with virgin queens. The scout bees, who performed elaborate dances, communicating exact coordinates of flower patches miles away. He taught her how to approach hives calmly, moving slowly because bees respond to movement and carbon dioxide from heavy breathing. How to use smoke to calm defensive behavior by triggering an instinct to gorge on honey in preparation for evacuation. How to inspect frames without crushing bees or damaging comb. How to identify healthy hives from struggling ones by watching entrance activity, listening to the hum, checking brood patterns. How to recognize and prevent swarming, diseases like American foul brood that could wipe out entire apiaries, pests like varroa mites, killing hives globally. But more importantly than technical knowledge, he fed her real substantial food her body desperately needed. Eggs from his chickens every morning, scrambled with cheese. Vegetables from his extensive garden, beans and squash and tomatoes and peppers. Bread he baked himself in a wood-fired oven. And honey, more than she'd eaten in her life, drizzled on biscuits and stirred into tea and eaten straight from the comb. Her body began recovering. She gained weight. Her hair stopped falling out. Her mind cleared from the fog of malnutrition. She could think again, plan, imagine a future beyond the next meal. They developed a routine that summer. She arrived at dawn, helped with morning hive inspections, walking the rows, checking each entrance for trouble. Worked in the garden, harvesting and weeding and watering from rain barrels. Learned whatever Samuel decided to teach that day, 50 years of knowledge to share. He fed her lunch, always substantial. They worked afternoon tasks, honey extraction during flow season, equipment maintenance, woodworking to build new boxes and frames. He sent her back at dusk with food for dinner and breakfast, items from his pantry packed carefully in her backpack. She never begged or asked directly. He never offered with expectation of gratitude or made her feel like a burden. It was exchange, partnership, the old mountain way. You work, you eat, you help, you're helped. Simple economics without money or contracts or government forms. By late July, Clara was competent enough that Samuel trusted her to handle hives independently while he supervised from a chair, his body still recovering from the massive sting attack. By August, she could split a hive to prevent swarming, requeen a struggling colony, extract and bottle honey without constant guidance. By September, she understood bee behavior better than most beekeepers with a decade of experience. Reading the hives like Samuel did, knowing when something was wrong before opening boxes. But she also noticed Samuel was declining in ways unrelated to bee stings. He moved slower each week, forgot things he'd told her yesterday, repeated stories multiple times without realizing, got confused about which hives they'd inspected. One September morning she arrived to find him trying to put on his boots, but unable to remember how laces worked. She helped him, made him breakfast, and when he was more lucid, asked gently if he'd seen a doctor. He admitted he hadn't, knew something was wrong. probably dementia or Alzheimer's, based on symptoms he'd been ignoring for months. Had no intention of seeing doctors because there was no treatment that would stop progression, and he'd rather die here with his bees than in a nursing home surrounded by strangers who didn't understand what his life had meant. He'd made peace with it, like he'd made peace with his wife's death and his own mortality. Clara hadn't made peace with it. Over the next month, she watched him fade in real time. Some days, he was sharp as ever, teaching new techniques, telling stories from 50 years of beekeeping. Other days, he didn't recognize her, called her by his dead wife's name, asked where his daughter was, though he'd never had children. She learned to work around his bad days, gently redirect confusion, keep the hives running while his mind slowly left him. In late September, he had a moment of unusual clarity. I was sitting on his porch at sunset, drinking tea with honey, watching bees return to hives for the night in their thousands. He turned to her and said, "Clara, I need to tell you something while I still can. I'm leaving you the bees. The hives, the land, the equipment, everything. My lawyer has the papers drawn up. When I die, it's all yours." She protested immediately. She was 16, couldn't legally own property, had no money to maintain an apiary, no way to make this work. He waved her objections away with the stubbornness that had kept him alive and independent for 75 years. "You'll figure it out," he said firmly. "You're smart, you work hard, you love the bees. That's what matters. Listen carefully. The bees will take care of you if you take care of them. Not just the honey, the community. People need what bees provide. You sell honey, you'll make money. You teach beekeeping, you'll make friends and have something to offer. You build this right, you'll never be alone or hungry again. This is my final gift. Don't waste it." He died 2 weeks later in his sleep. Clara found him in the morning when he didn't answer her knock, walked into the cabin, and saw him peaceful in his bed, hands folded on his chest, like he'd known it was time. She sat with him for an hour crying before hiking down to report his death to authorities, 'cause that's what he would have wanted. Proper handling, no complications. The funeral was small but more attended than expected. 27 people came, old-timers who remembered Samuel from before he became a hermit. Fellow beekeepers who'd known him for decades, people who'd bought his honey at farmers' markets. They brought food and condolences and questions. Who's taking the bees? Who owns the land now? What happens to 50 years of work? The lawyer, Thomas Warren, who'd handled Samuel's simple affairs for 20 years, read the will 3 days after the funeral. Samuel Oakes left his entire estate to Clara Reed. 40 acres of mountain land, cabin, 30 hives fully established and healthy. Complete beekeeping equipment, and a trust fund with $22,000 designated for property taxes, maintenance, and Clara's living expenses until she turned 18. After that, she was on her own, but would own everything outright. The valley was shocked. Some approved immediately, said Samuel saw something special in Clara, that he'd trained her properly and she deserved his legacy. Others said it was inappropriate, that a 16-year-old couldn't possibly manage that alone, that the arrangement was questionable. Clara didn't care what they thought. She moved into Samuel's cabin that night, sleeping in the small bedroom that still smelled like him. Wood smoke and honey and old wool blankets. The next morning at dawn, she opened the hives for inspection. The bees accepted her immediately. They knew her smell, her movements, her calm presence. She'd been their caretaker for months while Samuel declined. She inspected each hive methodically, the way Samuel taught her, checking brood patterns, food stores, queen activity. They were healthy, strong, ready for winter preparation. She had work to do and knowledge to guide her. She harvested the fall honey in October, 230 pounds of it, golden and thick from late-season goldenrod and aster. Bottled it in jars Samuel had stockpiled, hundreds in his storage shed, labeled them with handwritten tags that said Samuel's Mountain Honey, now tended by Clara. Took 40 jars to the farmer's market in town on Saturday morning. They sold out in 90 minutes. People tasted it, came back for more, asked about Samuel, listened to Clara explain she was continuing his work. She made $680 that first market, more money than she'd ever held. She came back the next week with 70 jars, sold out again in 2 hours. By November, she had a waiting list of customers wanting that specific honey from those specific mountains. By December, she was selling wholesale to 3 stores in Asheville, supplying them monthly, generating steady income. The money wasn't huge, but it was enough. Enough to pay property taxes, buy supplies, feed herself properly, save for emergencies. But more than money, something else started happening that Samuel had predicted. People showed up wanting to learn. A young woman named Jessica, who'd always wanted to keep bees but didn't know how. An older man named Frank, who used to keep bees decades ago and wanted to start again. A couple, Michael and Sarah, who wanted to buy starter hives and needed guidance. Clara realized what Samuel had meant. The bees created community. They gave us something to offer, knowledge people valued. She started teaching, one-on-one at first, then small groups of 3 or 4. Charged $50 per person for a 4-hour intensive workshop covering basics, hive inspections, seasonal management, honey harvesting. Not enough to get rich, but enough to value the knowledge she was sharing. Some students failed. Bees are difficult and unforgiving. But some succeeded, establishing their own hives, returning to Clara with questions, becoming part of a network. By spring, she had 14 active students learning beekeeping under her guidance. She helped them source equipment, sold them starter hives from her own splits, taught them everything Samuel had taught her. Some lived miles apart, but they started connecting, sharing resources and information, creating an informal beekeepers association for the valley. The bee population in the region increased. Pollination improved. Gardens produced better. Fruit trees yielded more. The whole ecosystem benefited from more beekeepers caring about bees. Clara turned 17 in May, 1 year after finding Samuel collapsed beside his hives. The community threw her a birthday gathering at the cabin, 43 people showing up with food and music and gifts. She stood on the porch looking at the crowd, at the hives beyond them with bees working in spring sunshine, and felt something she hadn't felt since before her parents died. She belonged. She had purpose. She had family, even if it wasn't blood family. One evening in late May, she sat on the porch where she and Samuel used to sit, drinking tea with honey, watching bees return home for the night. She pulled out one of Samuel's old journals she'd been reading, pages filled with his handwriting documenting 50 years of beekeeping. Found an entry from 30 years ago that made her cry. Kept bees today in perfect weather. Harvested early honey. Life is good when you're doing work that matters. When you're part of something bigger than yourself. When you know that what you do helps others. This is all I've ever wanted. Purpose and peace and bees. Clara understood completely now. She pulled out her own notebook and wrote her first journal entry, starting what would become her own lifelong record. 1 year since Samuel died. 1 year since I inherited the most valuable gift anyone could give. Not the land or the money or even the bees themselves, but the knowledge, the purpose, the understanding that my life can matter if I make it matter, that I can help others by sharing what I know. That family isn't always the one you're born into. Sometimes it's the one you build through shared work and mutual respect. Samuel, wherever you are, I hope you know I'm doing it right. The bees are thriving. The community is growing. I'm not alone anymore. Thank you for your final gift. I'll spend the rest of my life making it count. If this story of unlikely family and the power of bees touched something in you, hit that subscribe button now. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss these mountain stories about survival, found family, and the lessons nature teaches when we're willing to learn. Leave a comment and tell me what unexpected gift changed your life. Who saw potential in you that you didn't see in yourself? And share this video with someone who needs to know that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who choose to care for us when we need it most, who pass on knowledge that outlives them, who give us purpose when we've lost everything else. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.